Robert had been driving for hours, trying to get home after a long day at work. His mind was racing with thoughts of all the things he still needed to do: pick up groceries, help his son with homework, and make sure the house was in order before his wife got home. His daughter, Lily, was sitting in the back seat, quietly playing with her tablet as he tried to focus on the road. But as Robert drove down the highway, his attention started to slip. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was getting late, and he wanted to get home as quickly as possible. He pressed his foot a little harder on the gas pedal. The speedometer climbed, and before he knew it, he was speeding well above the limit. He didn't even notice the flashing lights in his rearview mirror until the police sirens started blaring. "Great," Robert muttered under his breath. He pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned off the engine. Lily looked up from her tablet, confused. "What's happening, Dad?" "Just a little traffic stop, sweetie," Robert said, trying to keep his voice calm. He rolled down the window as the officer approached his car, a serious look on his face. "Good evening, sir," the officer said, peering down at Robert. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Robert hesitated for a moment. I wasn't really paying attention to the speed," he admitted, his voice trailing off. "I've had a long day, officer. I just wanted to get home." The officer didn't seem to soften. "I understand, but speeding is still against the law. You were driving 15 miles over the limit. That's dangerous, not just for you, but for everyone on the road." Robert sighed and nodded. He knew the officer was right, but that didn't make the situation any easier. Lily shifted in the backseat, sensing the tension in the air. The officer asked for Robert's license and registration, and Robert fumbled a little as he handed them over. The officer took a moment to run the documents through his system, and when he came back to the car, he had a ticket in hand. "I'm issuing a fine today," he said. "I'll need you to sign here." Robert took the ticket and sighed deeply, knowing he had no choice but to accept it. "Thank you," he said, trying to hide his frustration. As the officer walked back to his car, Robert sat for a moment, staring at the ticket in his hand. Lily was quiet, her eyes focused on him. "Dad," she asked softly, "why were you speeding?" Robert looked over at her and smiled a little. "I was just trying to get home, sweetheart. Sometimes we make mistakes, but we learn from them." He hoped that Lily wouldn't fully understand the weight of the situation, but in the back of his mind, he knew this wouldn't be the last time he found himself in a similar situation. He couldn't help but feel guilty about setting the wrong example for his daughter, even though he hadn't intended to do so. As they drove off, Robert couldn't stop thinking about how easy it was to get caught up in the rush of life and forget the simple things that truly mattered. He vowed to do better, but deep down, he knew it would take more than just a moment of realization to make lasting change. The courtroom was quiet when Robert walked in, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never been in trouble with the law before, and now he was about to face the consequences of his speeding ticket. The tall wooden doors creaked as he entered, and the sound of footsteps echoed off the cold marble floors. Robert could feel all eyes on him, though he tried his best to look calm. His wife, Maria, was sitting in the back row, and Lily was by her side, both of them looking up at him with silent support. The judge, a stern man in his mid-50s with sharp glasses perched on the tip of his nose, was already seated at the bench. He looked down at the case file in front of him, and then up at Robert. "Mr. Davis, please step forward," the judge called in a firm voice. Robert's hands were slightly trembling as he walked to the front of the courtroom, feeling as though the walls were closing in on him. He didn't want to be there, but he knew he had to face the situation head-on. He glanced nervously at the gallery, where a few other people were seated, all waiting for their turn. The sound of the judge's gavel struck the air, and the room fell into a deep silence. "Mr. Davis," the judge began, "you have been charged with speeding. It appears you were driving 15 miles per hour over the limit. How do you plead?" Robert cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "Guilty, Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "I wasn't paying attention to the speed limit. I just wanted to get home to my family." The judge nodded thoughtfully, but his expression remained serious. "I understand, Mr. Davis, but the law doesn't change based on your intentions. Speeding is a serious offense, especially on busy roads. It puts others at risk." Robert felt a lump form in his throat. He had never meant to hurt anyone or cause any trouble. He had just been stressed from work, worried about getting home late, and now it was all catching up with him. "I understand, Your Honor," he said quietly. "I apologize. It won't happen again." The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at the paperwork again and jotted something down with a pen. Robert's mind wandered briefly as he thought about his wife and daughter. He didn't want them to be disappointed in him. He had always prided himself on being a responsible father, but this small mistake had thrown everything into uncertainty. "Mr. Davis," the judge spoke again, pulling Robert back into the moment. "I'm going to issue a fine for your violation. You will need to pay this amount by the end of the month. I suggest you take this as an opportunity to reflect on your actions and be more mindful on the road in the future." Robert nodded in agreement, thankful that the judge wasn't being harsher. He was ready to accept the fine and move on, though he felt a pang of guilt in his chest. As he was about to step away from the judge's bench, something unexpected happened. The doors of the courtroom opened with a soft click, and Robert's young daughter, Lily, stepped inside. She was holding her mother's hand, her little face full of curiosity. She looked around the room, her eyes wide with wonder. Before anyone could say a word, Lily marched to the front of the courtroom and stood beside Robert. All eyes in the room turned to her, and the tension in the air grew thick. Robert's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to come in at all. What was she doing here? Lily looked up at her father and then at the judge, her voice ringing out clearly as she spoke. "Dad's much worse," she declared, her innocent words echoing across the courtroom. Everyone turned their heads in surprise, unsure of what to make of the sudden statement. The entire courtroom went silent. It was as though time had frozen for a moment. Robert stood there, frozen in place, not knowing how to react. His daughter, Lily, was standing confidently beside him, looking up at the judge with her big, curious eyes. Robert glanced down at her, his heart racing. He had no idea what was going on in her little mind, but the words she had just spoken were clearly making everyone uncomfortable. The judge blinked a couple of times, clearly taken aback. He wasn't used to children speaking up in his courtroom, and certainly not with such confidence. The few people seated in the gallery looked at each other, whispering quietly, wondering what Lily could possibly mean by her strange comment. The air felt heavy, and Robert's face flushed with embarrassment. He tried to smile nervously at Lily, hoping she would realize her words were out of place, but she didn't seem fazed at all. "Sweetheart," Robert began gently, bending down to her level. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. Lily looked up at him as if the answer was the most obvious thing in the world. "Dad's much worse," she repeated, this time with more emphasis. "He speeds all the time when we drive. He drives really fast. Sometimes he doesn't even look at the speed signs." The words hung in the air, and Robert felt his stomach twist. He didn't want his daughter to think he was a reckless driver. But what Lily was saying wasn't far from the truth. It wasn't that Robert drove carelessly, but there had been plenty of times when he had pushed the speed limit, just a little, to save time or to avoid being late. And to be honest, he hadn't always been careful about it. The judge, now looking more intrigued than shocked, leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Davis," he said, his tone much softer than before, "is this true? Are you admitting to regularly exceeding the speed limit?" Robert felt his cheeks burn. He was caught, but he couldn't deny what his daughter had said. He swallowed hard and nodded slowly, his voice almost a whisper. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "I've made mistakes. I try to be a good father, but sometimes I get in a rush and don't pay enough attention to the road." The judge nodded thoughtfully, but there was still a sharpness in his eyes. "It's important to set a good example for your children, Mr. Davis. They watch everything you do, even when you think they're not paying attention." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "And it seems your daughter has noticed your driving habits." Robert stood silently, his heart heavy with regret. Lily, on the other hand, looked up at the judge and smiled brightly, as if she had just told an interesting story. She was completely unaware of the impact her words were having on her father. The room was still, and Robert's mind raced. He realized how much he had taken his daughter's innocence for granted. She hadn't been trying to embarrass him, but rather, she had just spoken the truth in a way that was as clear as day. It was in that moment that Robert understood just how important it was to be a role model, especially to his young daughter, who was so quick to observe his every move. After a long pause, the judge finally spoke again, his voice firm but understanding. "Mr. Davis, I'm going to issue a fine, as you are still responsible for your actions behind the wheel. However, I would encourage you to reflect on what your daughter has said today. She's right, you know. You need to be more mindful of your behavior, both on the road and in your everyday life. It's never too late to start setting a better example." Robert nodded, humbled by the judge's words. He looked down at Lily, who was still smiling up at him, completely unaware of the serious moment she had just created. As he glanced at the judge one more time, he silently promised himself that he would work harder to be the kind of father his daughter deserved. The judge then returned to his paperwork, and the tension in the room began to ease. The court session continued, but Robert's mind was elsewhere. He realized that what Lily had said wasn't just about speeding. It was about the bigger picture, about the little things that could shape her view of the world. And in that moment, Robert vowed to change his ways, not just for the ticket he had received, but for his daughter's future. The silence in the courtroom stretched on for a few more moments before the judge finally broke it. He tapped his gavel gently, signaling that it was time for the next case. Robert, still trying to recover from his daughter's unexpected outburst, slowly walked back to his seat, his thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and realization. He didn't know what had just happened. His daughter had spoken so boldly, without hesitation, and it had left him feeling exposed. He sat down beside Maria, who gave him a small, reassuring smile. Lily, sitting between them, looked around curiously at all the people in the courtroom, unaware of the weight of the situation. As Robert sat there, he couldn't help but glance over at Lily. Her innocent face seemed completely unaware of how much she had just impacted the room. She was busy twirling a lock of her hair, her small legs swinging back and forth from the bench, her tablet now forgotten in her lap. To her, this was just another new place to explore, a chance to see something different. But to Robert, it was much more than that. He felt like he was on the edge of something important, something that could change the way he viewed himself as a father and a man. Maria, sensing his distress, leaned over and whispered, "She's just being honest, Robert. You know that, right?" Robert nodded slowly. He knew Maria was right. Lily wasn't trying to embarrass him. She wasn't even aware of the effect her words had on the people around her. To her, it was just a simple truth, one she had picked up from watching her father's actions. And that realization hit Robert hard. His daughter had been watching him all along. She had been taking in everything he did, every decision he made, and even the little things he thought no one noticed. She was learning from him, just as all children learn from their parents. He couldn't shake the image of her standing there in front of the judge, speaking those words so clearly and confidently. Robert had always considered himself a good father, someone who tried his best to set a positive example for his children. But now, with Lily's words hanging in the air, he realized that his actions had not always reflected that ideal. He had been in a rush, often ignoring the rules of the road because it was easier to get to his destination faster. But now, more than ever, he understood that his daughter was paying attention to everything he did, and that he had to change his habits. Lily shifted in her seat and looked up at him with a wide grin. "Dad, are we going to get ice cream after this?" she asked, her voice full of excitement. It was clear she was already thinking about something else, moving on from the serious moment that had just passed. Robert forced a smile, feeling a little lighter from her question. Despite everything, his daughter still saw him as her superhero, the person she looked up to. And he knew that he couldn't let her down. "Maybe," Robert said, giving her a small wink. "We'll see." As the courtroom session came to a close, Robert gathered his things and stood up. He was ready to leave, but as he walked out of the room, he felt different. He was carrying the weight of what had happened, but he also felt a sense of responsibility that he hadn't fully realized before. He had always thought of himself as a good father, but today he realized he could be better. Lily skipped ahead of him as they made their way out of the courthouse, excited to go home and, of course, to get ice cream. Maria walked beside Robert, her hand gently touching his arm. "You'll do better, Robert," she said softly. "I know you will. We all make mistakes, but it's how we learn from them that counts." Robert gave her a small nod. "I will," he said, his voice steady. "For Lily. For all of us." As they left the courthouse behind, Robert felt a newfound determination. He had learned a powerful lesson that day, and he was ready to make the changes necessary to be the kind of father he wanted to be, not just for the ticket or for the courtroom, but for his daughter's future. As Robert and his family walked out of the courthouse, the bright sunlight hit their faces, and for the first time that day, Robert felt like he could breathe again. The heavy feeling of guilt that had settled in his chest throughout the court session was starting to lift. He had been so focused on the mistake he'd made with speeding, and so caught up in the embarrassment of his daughter's unexpected honesty, that he hadn't really thought about what he could do next. Now, as they walked down the steps, he realized something important. The whole experience had opened his eyes to how much he needed to change, not just for the sake of the law, but for the sake of his family. Lily skipped ahead of them, her small shoes tapping against the pavement as she happily hummed to herself. Robert couldn't help but smile as he watched her. She had such an easy way of moving through life, of leaving worries behind as if they didn't matter. He admired her innocence and simplicity. At that moment, he realized that it wasn't just about the ticket or the fine anymore. It was about being the kind of role model Lily could look up to. Maria, walking beside Robert, seemed to sense his thoughts. "You're quiet," she said, giving him a knowing glance. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Robert took a deep breath, then turned to her, his expression more thoughtful than before. I never realized how much she watches me. I guess I always thought I was doing the right thing. But today, Lily showed me that I need to do more than just say the right things. I need to show her what's right, every day." Maria smiled softly, her eyes warm. "You've always tried your best, Robert. But you're right. We all have moments where we need to step back and reassess. You're not perfect, but that's okay. What matters is that you care about doing better." Robert nodded, feeling a weight lifted from his shoulders. He wasn't perfect, and he didn't have to be. But he did want to be better, for Lily and for the rest of his family. He wanted to be the kind of father who set a positive example, not just in the big moments, but in the little everyday actions. He couldn't keep brushing off things that were important, like following the rules, especially when Lily was watching him so closely. As they got into the car and started the drive home, Robert couldn't stop thinking about the day's events. He wasn't just thinking about the speeding ticket, though. He was thinking about the bigger picture, about how his actions, no matter how small, shaped Lily's view of the world. If he was speeding without thinking, what other things was he doing that she might notice? What other habits was he unknowingly passing down to her? The car ride was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. Lily was already drifting off, her head resting against the window as she looked out at the passing scenery. Robert and Maria didn't need to say much. They both understood the significance of the moment. It wasn't just about the courtroom anymore. It was about the future, about the example Robert would set moving forward. Later that night, after they had settled in at home, Robert found himself reflecting even more. He took a few minutes alone, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the stars. There was something peaceful about the night sky, something that made him feel like everything was going to be okay. He thought about all the small things he could do to be better. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was something he needed to do. The next morning, as Robert got in the car to head to work, he made a promise to himself. He would start by being more mindful on the road. No more rushing, no more letting stress control his decisions. He would follow the speed limits, not just because it was the law, but because it was the right thing to do. And he would be more present with his family, more mindful of the small moments that truly mattered. Because after all, it was in those small moments that his daughter was learning what it meant to be a good person. As Robert drove, he couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. He wasn't perfect, and he knew he would make mistakes along the way. But as long as he was trying, as long as he was doing his best to be the father Lily deserved, that was all that mattered. And that thought made him smile as he drove down the road, taking things one step at a time. The next few weeks passed in a blur of routine for Robert, but there was something different about them. He noticed little changes in himself, and it was as if the whole world had slowed down just enough for him to catch up. He became more aware of his actions, whether he was speeding on the road or rushing through conversations with his family. He started to recognize those moments when he was setting a bad example. It wasn't easy, and there were times when he felt frustrated with himself, but he kept his promise to be more present, to take things one step at a time. One morning, as Robert was driving to work, he found himself approaching a familiar stretch of road where he had once habitually sped up, thinking he could get away with it. He glanced at the speedometer, then at the road ahead, and for the first time in a long while, he actually slowed down. He didn't care that he was running a little late, or that there weren't many cars around. He thought about Lily's face in the courtroom, her innocent words, and the way she had looked at him when she called him out for speeding. It made him stop and think, not just about the law, but about what kind of father he wanted to be. As he drove, he noticed the way the sun shone through the trees, casting soft shadows on the road. It was a simple moment, one he might have overlooked in the past, but now it felt like a small victory. He smiled to himself, feeling proud of the decision he had made. It wasn't a huge change, but it was a start. When he got home that evening, Robert was surprised to find Lily in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a crayon in her hand. She looked up at him with a grin as he walked in, clearly excited about something. "Dad, look," she exclaimed, holding up her drawing. "This is you and me and Mommy, all driving in the car, and we're going slow because we're being safe. See, you're going the speed limit." Robert paused, his heart swelling with pride. There on the paper was a simple drawing of their family in the car. But what made it so special was the message behind it. Lily had picked up on the changes he was making, and she was proud of him for it. It was a reminder that even though he had made mistakes, he was now taking steps to make things right. "That's a beautiful picture, Lily," he said, kneeling down beside her. "I'm really proud of you for drawing it." She beamed at him. "I wanted to show you that I see you trying to be better, Dad, and I think you're doing great." The words hit Robert harder than he expected. In that simple moment, Lily had shown him that she was paying attention to more than just his mistakes. She was noticing the effort he was putting in to be better, and that made all the difference. It was the kind of moment that reminded him why he was doing this in the first place, to be the kind of father who his daughter could look up to, not just in big moments, but in the everyday choices he made. Later that night, as Robert tucked Lily into bed, he kissed her goodnight and sat beside her for a moment. She looked up at him with sleepy eyes and asked softly, "Dad, do you think you'll keep driving slow now?" Robert smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yes, sweetheart," he said. "I'll keep driving slow, but I'll also try to be careful with everything I do. I want to be the best dad I can be for you." Lily yawned and snuggled into her blanket. "I think you're already the best, Dad." Robert's heart melted, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He didn't need to say anything. He knew that the path he was on, of making small but meaningful changes, was the right one. It wasn't always easy, and it wouldn't always be perfect, but it was a start. And it was enough. As Robert stood up and left the room, he felt a quiet sense of contentment. He knew there would be challenges ahead, and there would be times when he would fall short. But he also knew that his daughter had faith in him, and that was a powerful reminder to keep moving forward. That night, as he lay in bed beside Maria, he realized that the most important thing wasn't about getting things right all the time. It was about trying, about learning from his mistakes, and about showing his family that he was willing to do better. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered. A few months passed, and life began to settle into a rhythm. Robert was more conscious of his actions, both big and small. He had made a promise to be better, and while it hadn't always been easy, he was determined to follow through. His mornings had become a little more peaceful, with him taking his time on the drive to work, respecting the speed limits and focusing on the road ahead. He didn't rush anymore, even when he was late or under pressure. The feeling of driving with intention, of doing things with care, had become a habit that he was proud of. At home, things were better too. Robert found himself more present with his family. He didn't feel the need to rush through meals or conversations, and he made an effort to spend quality time with Lily. He realized that those little moments mattered more than he had ever imagined. Whether it was reading her favorite story before bed or just sitting and listening to her talk about her day, Robert had begun to truly appreciate the time they had together. One Saturday afternoon, Robert was cleaning out the garage when Lily came running out, excited about something. She waved a piece of paper in her hand as she rushed toward him. "Dad, guess what?" she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I got a star sticker today at school. I did really well on my math test." Robert smiled, feeling a rush of pride for her. "That's amazing, Lily. You're doing such a great job." Lily beamed, clearly happy to share her achievement. "I think it's because I'm getting better at following the rules now, just like you said," she said proudly. For a moment, Robert froze, feeling a lump in his throat. Lily had taken what he had taught her to heart. She wasn't just learning from him about speeding and being careful on the road. She was learning about responsibility and following rules in all areas of her life. It was a reminder that what he did, how he lived, had a lasting impact on her. She wasn't just mimicking his actions. She was understanding why those actions mattered. "Well, you've been working hard, Lily," Robert said, crouching down to her level. "I'm really proud of you. You're learning to make good choices, and that's something to be proud of." Lily smiled even wider, then gave him a quick hug. "Thanks, Dad." As the day went on, Robert felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just the big moments that mattered. It was these little ones, the everyday experiences that added up to something much greater. He knew that Lily was growing up with a stronger sense of what it meant to be responsible, kind, and thoughtful. She was becoming the kind of person he hoped she would be, and it made him feel like all the effort he was putting in was worth it. Later that evening, as Robert sat down to dinner with his family, he reflected on how far they had come. It hadn't been a perfect journey, but it had been a meaningful one. There had been challenges along the way, moments of frustration and self-doubt, but in the end, he had learned something valuable. Change doesn't have to be instant. It doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes, the smallest adjustments can lead to the most significant shifts. He had changed, but he had also learned that he didn't need to be perfect to be a good father. As they ate together, Lily chattered excitedly about her day at school, and Robert listened, his heart full. Maria sat beside him, smiling, clearly proud of the family they had become. It was in these moments, these simple, everyday moments, that Robert realized what truly mattered: being present, making better choices, and showing up for his family. They didn't need grand gestures or dramatic transformations. They just needed to keep moving forward together. As the evening came to a close and Lily was tucked into bed with another story, Robert sat down with Maria, their conversation easy and comforting. He smiled to himself, feeling a quiet peace settle over him. Life wasn't perfect, but he was doing his best, and that was enough. He was learning, growing, and showing his family what really mattered. And with every small step, he knew he was becoming the father they deserved. As the months continued to pass, Robert felt like he was living a quieter, more intentional life. He was no longer rushing through his days, caught up in the constant pressure to get ahead or meet some unrealistic standard. Instead, he found joy in the simple things, spending time with his family, having calm conversations, and teaching Lily important lessons about responsibility. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up and doing his best, even on the tough days. One afternoon, as Robert and Lily were walking to the park, he noticed something different. Lily, always chatty and curious, was unusually quiet, and Robert felt a subtle shift in the air. She was walking beside him, holding his hand, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his. Robert could tell something was on her mind, but she hadn't said a word. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Robert asked, gently squeezing her hand. Lily looked up at him, her big eyes thoughtful. "Dad, do you think I'm being a good kid?" she asked, her voice soft. Robert stopped in his tracks, surprised by the question. He knelt down in front of her, his heart swelling with emotion. "Of course you are, Lily," he said, his voice full of warmth. "You're kind, and you work hard. You always try to do the right thing, and that makes you a wonderful person." Lily smiled, but there was still a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "I just want to be as good as you, Dad. You're always trying to do the right thing." Robert felt a lump form in his throat. He had never expected to hear words like that from her. He had always thought that he needed to set the perfect example. But now, in this moment, he realized that it wasn't about being perfect. It was about being human, about showing his daughter that mistakes were okay, as long as you learned from them and kept trying. "You already are good, Lily," Robert said, brushing a stray hair from her face. "And you don't have to be perfect, just like me. What matters is that you keep trying, that you keep learning, and that you're kind to others. That's what makes you a great person." Lily's face lit up with a wide smile, and she squeezed his hand in return. "I'm trying, Dad," she said, her voice full of confidence. "I'm really trying." Robert stood up, feeling a warmth spread through him. In that moment, he knew that his daughter was already on the right path. She had learned from his mistakes, his growth, and now she was making her own way in the world. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about the effort, the intention, and the love you put into everything you do. As they continued their walk to the park, Robert reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. It had been full of challenges and moments of self-doubt, but it had also been filled with growth. He had learned that perfection wasn't the goal. Progress was. He didn't need to have all the answers or get everything right. All he needed to do was show up, be present, and keep learning, just like Lily. As they reached the park, Lily ran ahead, her laughter filling the air as she ran toward the swings. Robert watched her for a moment, feeling the deep sense of gratitude. She had taught him just as much as he had taught her, if not more. In a way, this journey of growth had brought them closer together, strengthening their bond in ways he hadn't expected. Later that evening after dinner, Robert sat down with Maria. They didn't need to say much. They both knew how much they had grown over the past few months. They had become better partners, better parents, and better people. As they talked quietly, Robert realized that it wasn't the big moments that had changed everything. It was the small, everyday choices they had made. The decision to slow down, to be more present, to make things right when they went wrong. It was in the little moments that true change happened. Robert smiled to himself, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. But he also knew that, with each new day, he was becoming the man he wanted to be, the father Lily deserved. He had learned that life wasn't about being perfect. It was about trying, growing, and always being there for the people who mattered most. And with that thought in his heart, he felt ready for whatever.